Sometimes the hardest thing God will ever ask of you is to wait. Not because he is slow, but because his perspective stretches beyond your moment. When he tells you that change is coming for someone in your life, you have to remember he is speaking from the vantage point of eternity, not from the narrow slice of time you and I can see. Our impatience comes from our limited view. We want visible progress, tangible results, quick turnarounds. But God's work is often hidden beneath the surface, like the seed under the soil. You can't see the roots spreading, you can't feel the life stirring underground, but that doesn't mean nothing is happening. One of the greatest tests of faith is believing God's word about a person when everything about that person contradicts what he promised. And if you've ever been in that position, you know it feels like standing in the middle of a storm with nothing to hold on to but a sentence God spoke to your heart. Every outward sign says you should move on. Logic tells you it's over. Friends advise you to give up. Yet God whispers, not yet. That's not just about them, it's also about you. Because waiting in faith transforms you as much as it transforms them. There's a reason God's timing rarely matches ours. Transformation is not mechanical, it's organic. People don't change because you nag them into it. They change when the Spirit of God has prepared the soil of their hearts. That preparation might involve setbacks, failures, or seasons of isolation. Sometimes it even requires them to hit rock bottom, so they finally look up. From the outside, that process can be agonizing to watch. You want to step in, to fix, to speed it up. But every time you try to take control, you risk uprooting what God is still nurturing beneath the surface. Think of Moses. Called to deliver Israel, but sent to the wilderness for 40 years before he ever stood before Pharaoh. Think of Paul, gifted, educated, and passionate, but God still pulled him away for years before unleashing his ministry. Even Jesus, though perfect, waited 30 years before stepping into public ministry. If the perfect Son of God was subject to the Father's timing, what makes us think we can force transformation on our own schedule? When God says they will change, it's not wishful thinking, it's not human optimism, it's a divine declaration, and his word never returns void. But he doesn't always give you the play-by-play. He simply says, trust me, and that's where your faith gets tested, not in the easy moments where everything lines up, but in the long stretches of silence where nothing appears to be moving. It's in those stretches that the enemy will try to plant doubt in your mind. Did God really say that? That's the same question he used in the garden, and it's the same tactic he uses today. You have to learn to anchor yourself to God's promise, not the present circumstances. That means rehearsing his word in your heart until it becomes louder than the voices of doubt. It means remembering his track record in your life, recalling the times he came through when it looked impossible. Because here's the truth. If God was patient with you while you were still in process, then you can be patient with them while God works in their life. The same grace that carried you is capable of carrying them. Now let me make something clear. Waiting on God does not mean tolerating abuse, neglect, or harmful behavior. There is a difference between holding on in faith and holding on to something toxic. Waiting on God requires discernment. Sometimes God tells you to release someone into his hands completely and step aside. Other times, he asks you to remain in place, not as a passive bystander, but as an active intercessor. That's why prayer is so critical in this season. It keeps you connected to God's heart and helps you discern whether you're holding on out of faith or fear. God's timing is deliberate. Every delay is purposeful. If he says they will change, it means he has already factored in their mistakes, detours, and resistance. He has accounted for every variable you can't see. And when his timing comes, the change will not be partial. It will be complete, lasting, and undeniable. You won't have to force it. You won't have to manipulate it. It will bear the unmistakable fingerprints of God. So while you wait, let your posture be one of trust, not tension. Trust says, God, I believe you even if I can't track you. Trust says, your plan is better than my impatience. Trust says, if you can raise the dead, you can certainly restore this person's life. And maybe that's what this whole season is about. Not just them changing, but you deepening your faith in the God who never lies. If God says they will change, then hold on to that word like your life depends on it, because in some ways it does. Not your physical life, but your life of faith. Your endurance in this moment will shape your testimony for years to come. And when the change finally comes, you'll know it wasn't your cleverness, your pressure, or your strategy that did it. It was the sovereign hand of God. The question is, can you trust him enough to wait for what he promised, even when you can't see it yet? Because the one who trusts in the Lord will never be put to shame. Sometimes the greatest obstacle to seeing someone's transformation is not their unwillingness to change, but our unwillingness to believe they can. God can declare a new future over someone's life, but if the people closest to them still hold them hostage to their past, they may never fully step into it. And here's the sobering truth. Sometimes we become the barrier God has to work around, not because we're malicious, but because we've grown so accustomed to who they were that we can't embrace who they're becoming. If God is saying, don't let them go yet, then part of your role is to keep your vision for them aligned with his. That means you cannot define them solely by their mistakes, their failures, or their immaturity. You have to be able to see beyond the present, to look at them through the lens of God's promise rather than the lens of your disappointment. Faith is not blind optimism. It is rooted in the unshakable belief that what God has spoken is more real than what you see right now. There's a subtle but important difference between believing in someone and believing in God's ability to transform them. When you put your faith solely in a person, you will eventually be let down because people are inconsistent and change is rarely linear. But when your faith is in God's work within them, you're anchoring yourself to the only one who is constant, that allows you to endure the setbacks without collapsing in discouragement. The process of change, especially spiritual change, is often messy. It rarely moves in a straight line. There will be moments when they take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. That's when the temptation to give up is strongest. When you feel like you've invested hope after hope, prayer after prayer, and nothing sticks. But just because the fruit isn't visible doesn't mean the seed is dead. In fact, some seeds take the longest to sprout because they're developing the deepest roots. When God says to hold on, he's inviting you into a role that requires both patience and resilience. Patience means you're willing to wait without resentment. Resilience means you're willing to keep standing even when the emotional winds are against you. It's not about pretending the struggle isn't hard. It's about choosing not to let the hardness make you quit. Think about the story of the prodigal son. The father didn't chase his son into the far country, but neither did he write him off. He kept the door open, kept his heart soft, and kept his eyes on the horizon. The son's return wasn't guaranteed by human standards, but the father lived as if it was inevitable. And when the son finally did come home, the father didn't hesitate, didn't interrogate, didn't remind him of his failures. He embraced him. That's the kind of posture God calls us to have toward those he's told us to hold on to. Of course, holding on doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior or allowing yourself to be mistreated. Sometimes holding on is more about holding on to God's promise in prayer than holding on to the person in proximity. There are seasons where you may need to create space, not out of anger, but to let God do the work only he can do. True love has boundaries, and faith understands that God's ways sometimes require distance as much as closeness. But here's the key. You cannot let your hope expire before God says it's time. Our culture is quick to discard people, to walk away at the first sign of difficulty, but God is a God of redemption, and he doesn't operate on a use once and throw away mentality. If he's spoken to you that this person will change completely, then your job is to steward that promise well. That might mean praying when you feel tired, encouraging them when they feel hopeless, and refusing to speak words that reinforce their old identity. Words are powerful. If you keep telling someone they're unreliable, lazy, or broken, you're reinforcing the chains God is trying to break. But if you start speaking life, calling out the potential you see in them, and affirming what God has already declared, you become an ally in their transformation instead of a hindrance. Sometimes the most Christ-like thing you can do is to speak to the person they're becoming rather than the person they've been. Holding on is not passive. It's active faith. It's believing that the same God who parted the Red Sea, who turned Saul into Paul, who raised Lazarus from the dead, can take a life that looks stuck and breathe it into a new future. When that change comes, and you'll realize that the waiting, the praying, the believing was never wasted. It was all part of the process that not only transformed them, but transformed you into someone with greater depth, greater compassion, and greater trust in God. You may not see all the signs right now. You may still feel the weight of the gap between the promise and the reality, but the God who spoke the word is faithful to perform it. Your role is not to make it happen. Your role is to believe, to pray, and to stay in position until God's timing brings it to pass. When it does, when you see the complete change with your own eyes, you'll know deep in your soul it wasn't your strength, your strategy, or your pressure that made it happen. It was the sovereign hand of God. And that realization will not only restore your hope in them, it will restore your awe of Him. So here's the question you have to answer. Will you be found faithful when the change finally comes, or will you have let go too soon? Because the miracle you've been praying for might be closer than you think. Don't step away just before the breakthrough arrives.